Do you ever remember the BSAA? Well, they play a much bigger role in the Resident Evil series than most people realize. In fact, they've been the driving force, or at least a quiet presence, behind nearly every major event after Resident Evil 4. They've been involved with big organizations like the F.B.C, Blue Umbrella, Tricell, and The Connections. But what are these groups really about? And how do they even connect to the BSAA? Because somewhere along the way, things changed. The BSAA didn't stay the heroes they were meant to be. So what really happened? As the saying goes, you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And that's exactly what happened when the BSAA turned on everything they once stood for. After the Raccoon City incident and the city's destruction, Umbrella was finished. Publicly disgraced and financially ruined, its stock collapsed. Its assets were seized and the company ultimately filed for bankruptcy. But even with Umbrella gone, the fear never disappeared. Because Umbrella was never the real problem. The real problem was what the company represented, the proven ability and willingness to create bioorganic weapons. Raccoon City had shown the world that bioterrorism wasn't theoretical, it was scalable, and it could happen anywhere. In response, the United States and other world governments were forced to acknowledge a new kind of global threat, one that no single nation could realistically contain alone. This led to the first serious international efforts to support anti-bioterror initiatives. Out of that fear, the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance was formed, the BSAA. Established in 2004, the BSAA was envisioned as a UN-sanctioned international task force, dedicated to combating the growing threat of bioorganic weapons in the post-Umbrella era. In its earliest form, however, the organization was not a government military force. It began as a privately funded paramilitary NGO. Its initial funding came from the Federation of Pharmaceutical Companies, the Global Pharmaceutical Consortium, a coalition of drug corporations that had previously been implicated in Umbrella's illicit research programs. For many, the BSAA's creation was as much a public relations effort as it was a security measure, a way for those companies to atone for their past involvement by helping prevent future disasters. Headquartered in the United Kingdom, the BSAA started small, just 11 members, including former STARS officers Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine. At this stage, the organization held only observer status. It had no real authority of its own, and required permission from host nations before it could conduct any operations. In practice, this meant the BSAA often had to rely on local governments and existing agencies to operate. Despite its noble mission, many countries were uneasy about a foreign semi-private organization operating within their borders. Sovereignty concerns and political distrust limited where and how the BSAA could intervene, restrictions that would quietly shape the organization's future. In its early years, the BSAA was more symbol than shield, but as bioterror incidents continued to escalate, that would begin to change. In 2004, the BSAA faced its first real test during the Terra Grigia panic. Terra Grigia was a Mediterranean city built out in the open sea, designed to be completely self-sustaining, a showcase of modern civilization. When the terror group Il Veltro released bioorganic weapons inside the city, it came as an inevitable surprise. For many, it felt like the first sign that bioterror was no longer contained to isolated incidents. It was becoming a global threat. This incident was also the first time Chris and Jill saw action as BSAA agents. Up until then, BSAA was mostly just an idea, a newly formed organization still trying to figure out its place. For Chris and Jill, it was the first time they were operating under the BSAA name instead of working on their own. What they saw here would quietly influence how both of them viewed organizations and authority in the years ahead. But despite being created to fight bioterror, the BSAA wasn't the one in charge of this incident. Jurisdiction instead fell to the Federal Bioterrorism Commission, the F.B.C, a US-backed agency created in the aftermath of Raccoon City to centralize America's response to bioterror threats. Unlike the BSAA, the F.B.C had full government authority and could act without the political limits placed on independent organizations. BSAA Director Clive R. O'Brien was present during the Terra Grigia response, but the BSAA itself was largely sidelined. As a privately funded NGO with observer status, it lacked the legal authority to intervene. To stop the outbreak, the entire city was deliberately destroyed, sunk under the sea in the name of containment. And then the real truth started to come to the surface. O'Brien began to suspect that the F.B.C.'s commissioner, Morgan Lansdale, was trying to control bioterrorism instead of stopping it. Lansdale had secretly manipulated Il Veltro and engineered the Terra Grigia panic as a power move, using fear as an excuse to expand the F.B.C.'s global authority. In 2005, O'Brien acted outside official channels and launched a covert operation to expose the truth. What happened aboard the Queen Zenobia confirmed his suspicions. The disaster had been planned from inside the very organization that was meant to prevent it. The fallout was immediate. Morgan Lansdale was arrested, the F.B.C. was disbanded in disgrace, and public trust in centralized bioterror agencies was shattered. But exposing the truth came at a cost. To protect the BSAA from political backlash and preserve its fragile legitimacy, Clive O'Brien resigned from his position. Terra Grigia became a defining moment. This incident taught the organization that doing the right thing sometimes meant breaking the rules. That lesson, learned at the very beginning, planted the first seed of moral drift that would quietly grow over the years to come. For Chris and Jill, Terra Grigia was the moment they realized that stopping bioterrorism wouldn't just mean fighting monsters. It would mean navigating institutions that could be just as dangerous. By late 2005, the BSAA was placed under direct United Nations authority. In the wake of Terra Grigia and the collapse of the F.B.C., the UN came to a clear conclusion. Bioterrorism was no longer a problem any single country could handle on its own. To prevent another global disaster, the BSAA was officially sanctioned and given the authority to operate internationally with far greater autonomy. For the first time, the BSAA could pursue bioterror across borders, detain suspects, and intervene without having to rely entirely on local agencies. The organization was restructured into multiple regional commands, allowing it to respond faster and operate on a truly global scale. By 2006, the BSAA had effectively become the world's primary anti-bioterror force, stepping into the role left behind by the disbanded F.B.C. But this new power came with limits. Not every nation was comfortable with the UN-backed force operating freely inside its borders. While the BSAA was UN-sanctioned, its authority still depended on national approval, and the US consistently chose to rely on its own agencies, allowing the BSAA only limited involvement. As a result, the BSAA was forced to operate with political sensitivities constantly in mind. From this point on, the BSAA was fighting more than just bioterrorism. It was also navigating diplomacy, jurisdiction, and trust. Pressures that would quietly change how the organization chose to act in its years ahead. Soon after gaining UN authority, bioterror incidents began surfacing across the globe, and the BSAA found itself constantly deployed on the front lines. One of its most significant early operations was the Kijuju Incident in 2009. Civil unrest in the Kijuju region of West Africa concealed something far worse, an outbreak of type 2 plaga-infected locals. The BSAA's West Africa branch was dispatched to investigate, led by Chris Redfield alongside local operative Sheva Alomar. Behind the outbreak was Tricell, one of the BSAA's own sponsors and financial backers. One of the world's largest multinational pharmaceutical and industrial corporations. Publicly, Tricell specialized in medicine, energy, and global infrastructure projects, positioning itself as a force for humanitarian progress. Privately, it had inherited Umbrella's old networks, research, and ambitions. Tricell's regional CEO, Excella Guione, had secretly partnered with Albert Wesker, a renegade Umbrella scientist, to develop the Ouroboros virus, a bioweapon capable of forced human evolution. All the while, Tricell continued to fund the BSAA, effectively bankrolling the fight against bioterror as it actively created it. The betrayal became undeniable when BSAA teams discovered a hidden Tricell Umbrella research facility beneath Kijuju. The operation quickly turned catastrophic. Entire BSAA units were wiped out by advanced POWs, and casualties mounted as the true scale of the conspiracy came to light. Despite the losses, Chris and Sheva managed to stop Wesker and prevent the global release of Ouroboros, ending the immediate threat. Once Tricell's involvement came to light, the company fell apart fast. Its African operations spiraled into chaos, with facilities abandoned or overrun as outbreaks spread and broke down everything internally. With its leadership dead and its secrets exposed, Tricell was effectively finished as a global power. The Kijuju Incident wasn't entirely a victory. The BSAA had saved the world, only to discover that one of its own benefactors had been deeply involved in bioweapons development all along. The irony wasn't lost on the public, nor on the organization's leadership. With Tricell gone, a quiet question emerged inside the BSAA, one that would never be publicly answered. Who was now financing the organization's rapidly expanding global war against bioterror? Tricell's downfall also left behind a power vacuum in the bioweapons black market, one that would soon be filled by even more dangerous players. In the years that followed Kijuju, the BSAA dealt with a series of smaller-scale outbreaks around the world. Each operation expanded its reach, sharpened its tactics, and added more personnel and firepower to its ranks. But everything the organization had learned would soon be tested on a scale it had never faced before. In 2012, the global outbreak began, a worldwide escalation of bioterrorism carried out by a group known as Neo Umbrella. Neo Umbrella released the C virus, a weapon designed to cause mass chaos through unpredictable mutation, infection, and rapid escalation. The outbreak spread across North America, Eastern Europe, and China, throwing entire cities into chaos. By this stage, Chris Redfield had been through more than most soldiers survive in a lifetime. Each victory had come at a cost, and with every new outbreak, his faith that this war could never truly end began to fade. But Piers Nivens was there to remind him why the fight still mattered. That with the power the BSAA now held, came responsibility, not retreat. For Chris, Piers became the anchor that kept him leading instead of walking away. The BSAA was now no longer a small international task force. It had grown into a massive global organization, with branches on every continent and access to heavy weapons, armored vehicles, and full-scale military hardware. When the C virus began spreading, the BSAA mobilized immediately. BSAA forces were deployed to major conflict zones like Edonia in Eastern Europe and Lanxing, China, where Chris Redfield led large strike units directly into active war zones filled with Neo Umbrella's BOWs. At the same time, the United States relied on its own agency, the DSO, with Leon S. Kennedy handling the outbreak on American soil. This division of responsibility was revealing. The BSAA fought the world's wars, while nations still protected their own borders. The Neo Umbrella crisis was eventually brought to an end, but not before catastrophic global casualties. Entire cities were devastated, countless civilians were lost, and BSAA units suffered heavy losses across multiple fronts. As the war against Neo Umbrella escalated, Chris began losing more men than he could count. Entire units were wiped out in moments, no matter how prepared they were. It was a harsh reminder that no amount of experience or firepower could change one truth. Chris was still human, and when the weight of command threatened to break him, it was Piers who kept the purpose of the BSAA alive, reminding him that even in failure, saving what could be saved still mattered. Piers gave his life to help Chris destroy a massive BOW and prevent the outbreak from escalating even further. He hadn't been with the BSAA for long, but in that short time, he embodied everything the organization was meant to stand for. When Chris started to lose faith in the war, in the mission, and in himself, Piers believed for him. His sacrifice wasn't just about stopping a BOW, it was proof that as long as people were still willing to fight, there was still hope of making the world a better place. Chris couldn't let that death mean nothing, and it became the reason he kept going. Piers was the heart of the BSAA's mission, the new generation willing to get their hands dirty so others could stay clean. The BSAA had succeeded. Humanity had been saved, again. But something had clearly changed. The BSAA was no longer just a rapid response organization. It had become a standing army, built for constant warfare against evolving biothreats. By the end of 2013, the BSAA had once again proven itself indispensable, yet the cost was mounting, not just in lives lost, but in the toll taken on the people fighting these endless wars. The organization was stronger than ever, but the strain was beginning to show. And no matter how the world changed, Chris carried something unbreakable now. A responsibility forged by loss, and a certainty that he would always choose what was right, even if he had to stand alone. By 2014, the BSAA was still standing, at least on the surface. Outbreaks continued to appear across the world, Smaller than the global crisis of the past, but no less dangerous. Each time, the pattern was the same. The BSAA responded, the threat was stopped, and the world moved on. To the public, the organization still looked reliable, but the BSAA was nowhere near invincible. In Mexico, a BSAA operation to apprehend a bioterrorist named Glenn Arias ended in disaster, when it was revealed that Arias had taken over the resources of Tricell and Neo Umbrella after they had collapsed. Arias anticipated the assault and wiped out the entire strike team, leaving Chris as the sole survivor. Months later, Arias resurfaced in New York, releasing a new virus on a civilian population. Once again, the situation was contained, not because of flawless planning, but because familiar names were there to stop it. Chris, Leon, Rebecca. The following year, another outbreak hit San Francisco, spreading silently through civilians who had unknowingly been infected days earlier. When the truth surfaced, the response wasn't led by new faces or fresh leadership. It was carried by the same veterans who had been fighting since the beginning. Jill Valentine returned to the field, alongside Chris, Leon, Claire, and Rebecca to stop the disaster before it escalated into something worse. The BSA's image was no longer upheld by its structure or its leadership. It was carried almost entirely by its legacy heroes. As long as someone with experience stepped in, the system held together. But that stability was an illusion. Behind the scenes, leadership decisions were becoming increasingly reactive. The organization was relying less on prevention and more on escalation. By the end of 2015, the BSA was still winning, but it was no longer healthy. The wars never stopped, the enemies never ran out, and the burden kept falling on the same shoulders, people who were beginning to realize that the organization they were holding up might not be holding them back. And that realization would matter very soon. By the mid-2010s, something deeply ironic had already taken shape. Umbrella was coming back. Not the umbrella that destroyed Raccoon City, but something built from its remains. After the original Umbrella Corporation collapsed in 2003, its assets were seized and its operations were shut down. But the knowledge it had created didn't disappear. The research, the data, the countermeasures, all of it still existed. And governments were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. The same science that created bioterrorism was now essential to stopping it. In 2007, under direct US government supervision, Umbrella's American branch was reorganized into a new entity. Officially, it was Umbrella USA Reborn, but to signal a break from the past, its red and white symbol was recolored blue, and thus Blue Umbrella was born. Its leadership was made up of former Umbrella employees, who were vetted and approved by the US government, presented as a clean slate, or at least as clean as Umbrella could ever be. To the public, Blue Umbrella claimed its purpose was atonement, not profit or power, but fixing the damage Umbrella had caused. Unlike the original Umbrella, this new organization was placed under strict limitations. Because of Umbrella's history, the United Nations explicitly forbade Blue Umbrella from maintaining its own standing army or private security force. No independent strike teams, no autonomous military operations. Every move it made was monitored. Blue Umbrella was allowed to research cures, develop anti-BOW weapons, gather intelligence, and assist with containment and cleanup, but it could not pull the trigger itself. To operate in the field, Blue Umbrella needed someone else. That role fell to the BSAA. Since Blue Umbrella was barred from deploying its own forces, all field operations were carried out through BSAA cooperation. Blue Umbrella provided technology, data systems, and specialized equipment. The BSAA provided the boots on the ground. Their scientists and advisors entered hot zones under BSAA protection, while the BSAA units themselves benefited from tools built using Umbrella's old research. On paper, it worked, but in reality, it was uneasy from the start. Chris never trusted Umbrella, and Blue Umbrella didn't do much to change that. Even as he used their weapons, relied on their intelligence, and led missions supported by their technology, the suspicion never left. To Chris, Blue Umbrella wasn't proof that Umbrella had changed. It was proof that its shadow still hadn't disappeared. And the irony was impossible to ignore. Umbrella, once an unchecked corporate monster, was now restrained, monitored, and bound by oversight. The BSAA, founded with noble intentions, was growing more powerful, more militarized, and less transparent with every passing year. One organization had been forced into chains, the other had been allowed to grow unchecked. From 2007 through the late 2010s, the partnership held. Blue Umbrella followed the rules, the BSAA provided the muscle, but trust never followed, and that distrust mattered. Because when the next crisis came, the one that would finally push Chris past the breaking point, it wouldn't just test whether Blue Umbrella could be trusted, it would expose what the BSAA itself had quietly become. By the time the BSAA entered 2017, something had already gone wrong, even if no one wanted to admit it. The organization was larger than ever, better equipped, more experienced, and yet one of the most dangerous bioweapons ever created had already slipped through its fingers. Years earlier, during a failed interception at sea, an experimental bioweapon known as Eveline escaped containment. The incident was quietly closed, assumed resolved. It wasn't. Eveline survived, reached land, and vanished without triggering immediate alarms. For a long time, nothing seemed wrong, and that silence became the mistake. When she finally resurfaced in rural Louisiana, it wasn't as a sudden outbreak, but as something far worse. A threat that had been growing, adapting, and spreading silently for years. By the time the BSAA realized what had been missed, it was already too late. That failure would come back to haunt them in Dulvey, Louisiana. The Baker House incident didn't begin as a sudden disaster. It had been quietly festering for years in the swamps outside the area. At its center was Eveline's influence, a mold-based organism capable of rewriting minds, reshaping bodies, and turning entire families into obedient hosts. Created by the criminal syndicate known as the Connections, she was designed to look like a child, not to blend in, but to control. The BSAA had crossed paths with Eveline once before, during a failed interception in Europe. She escaped, and when she resurfaced years later in Louisiana, it wasn't the BSAA that discovered Dulvey, it was Blue Umbrella. By mid-2017, Blue Umbrella had identified abnormal mold activity around the Baker estate and discovered something else. Lucas Baker was not a victim. He was now working with the Connections, conducting research from an underground lab and preparing to sell Eveline's data to an unknown buyer. Blue Umbrella immediately alerted the BSAA, and together they launched Operation Lurking Fear. Chris Redfield was chosen to lead the operation, not as a symbol, but as damage control. He arrived at the Baker property just as civilian Ethan Winters confronted Eveline herself. Chris provided Ethan with a specialized anti-BOW weapon, allowing Eveline to be neutralized at last. But the operation didn't end there. While one team secured survivors and extracted Ethan and Mia Winters, Chris led another force underground into the salt mines beneath Dulvey to hunt Lucas Baker. Lucas knew what was coming, and he turned the tunnels into a maze of traps, wiping out an entire BSAA unit and nearly killing Chris himself. Guided remotely by Blue Umbrella analysts, Chris pushed forward anyway. Far deep in the mines, he confronted Lucas as he was trying to upload his research. Lucas was killed, the data was destroyed, the last direct link to the Connections experiment was cut. On paper, the mission was a success. In reality, Dulvey was far from finished. With Eveline gone and Lucas eliminated, the BSAA and Blue Umbrella established a quarantine zone around the bayou. Walls were raised, labs were built, cleanup operations began, and as the mold threat was assumed to be collapsing, Jack Baker returned. Mutated and seemingly unkillable, he broke through the quarantine zone, killing BSAA soldiers and Blue Umbrella personnel. The containment perimeter failed and communications broke down. And in the end, it wasn't the BSAA that stopped him. It was Joe Baker, Jack's own brother, a man completely outside the system. He managed to put Jack down and administered the final cure to Zoe Baker, saving the last surviving member of the family. By the time Chris arrived with reinforcements, the fighting was over. Dulvey was finally contained. That should have been the end. Instead, it became a reckoning. Internally, the BSAA classified Dulvey as a catastrophic institutional failure. Investigations concluded that the organization's earlier missteps, including a classified failure in Europe years prior, had allowed Eveline to escape in the first place. Dulvey was just a consequence, and the truth was inconvenient, so the BSAA buried it. The public story blamed a vague industrial accident, a gas leak. The Bakers were listed as deceased. Zoe Baker, though alive, was erased from records. Military sightings, helicopters, and even reports of monsters were quietly dismissed or suppressed. One of the largest cover-ups in BSAA history was executed, not to protect civilians, but to protect the institution itself. For Chris, Dulvey changed everything. This was the moment he stopped trusting symbols, logos, organizations, chains of command, and started trusting only people. Ethan, Joe, individuals who did what needed to be done when the system failed. And after Dulvey, something else happened. Nothing. No public reform, no accountability, just silence. And that silence would last until 2021. Internally, the BSAA classified the Baker House incident as a failure, not just of containment, but of judgment. Soldiers had died and civilians had been erased from records. The truth had been buried, and yet, outwardly, nothing changed. After 2017, the BSAA didn't collapse. It withdrew. Operations continued, but details became harder to access. Oversight grew thinner, and decisions were made farther from the field. The organization that once prided itself on transparency began operating behind sealed doors, justified by the argument used every time before. This is for the greater good. For Chris, this is where it crossed the line, even if it happened quietly. Dulvey had taught him something the BSAA refused to acknowledge. Institutions don't fail all at once. They drift, they compromise, they justify. And by the time the consequences are visible, the decay has already set in. Chris stopped believing in formal organizations regardless of their intentions. He trusted people, and fewer of them every year. After 2017, the BSAA became more difficult to define. Not openly corrupt, not openly villainous, just opaque. A global force with enormous reach, minimal scrutiny, and a growing belief that any method was acceptable if it prevented the next disaster. And then came the village. In early 2021, a bioterror incident came up in a remote Eastern European region, a place isolated, insular, and already consumed by something ancient. The BSAA responded as it always had, by deploying a strike force to eliminate the threat. Chris refused to go with them. For the first time in his career, Chris rejected BSAA command entirely. Instead, he formed his own unit, an independent team later known as the Hound Wolf Squad. They operated outside BSAA authority, using their own intelligence and their own rules. Chris no longer trusted the organization to handle bioterrorism without making things worse. The BSAA strike force moved in anyway. They didn't last very long. The assault team was destroyed almost immediately by the creatures infesting the village. Communications was lost and the operation had collapsed before it even began. And when Chris and his squad arrived in the aftermath, they found something far worse than a failed mission. One of the deceased BSAA soldiers wasn't human. Under the uniform was a bioorganic weapon. Not an infected soldier, not a mutated casualty. A manufactured BOW deployed intentionally as a frontline trooper. The realization was bleak. The BSAA, an organization created to stop bioweapons, had begun using them. Umbrella believed control justified creation. The BSAA believed protection justified imitation. Where Umbrella once crossed the line in the name of progress, the BSAA crossed it in the name of safety. Different language, same logic. After the village was destroyed and the immediate threat neutralized, Chris made a decision that carried more weight than any firefight. He ordered his squad to divert course, straight towards the BSAA's European headquarters, to confront the institution itself. For years, the BSAA had drifted in silence, and in 2021, that silence finally broke. The BSAA was never born evil. It was born from fear and from responsibility. From the belief that if no one stood between the world and bioterrorism, no one would survive the next Raccoon City. For years, it held that line. It stopped outbreaks, it saved lives, it sent ordinary people into impossible situations and asked them to endure what most people never could. But strength changes institutions. What began as cooperation became authority. What began as necessity became habit. And somewhere along the way, the mission stopped being to stop bioterrorism and became to control it. That doesn't erase what the BSAA accomplished, but it explains what it survived. The story of the BSAA isn't about good turning evil overnight. It's about how even the most noble causes can drift when fear replaces accountability and urgency replaces reflection. And yet, the most important truth still remains. When the system failed, people didn't. And countless unnamed soldiers who held the line when orders were unclear and the cost was absolute. They remind us that institutions may falter, but principles don't vanish unless we abandon them. The BSAA story is a warning, but it's also a reminder. Power must be watched, authority must be questioned, and protection is only meaningful when it refuses to become what it fears. Whatever comes next, the lesson is clear. Good and evil are never decided by force alone, but by stronger values, and that fight never ends.